In this short talk, recorded in the context of the pandemic, I'm going to think about objectivity. Objectivity is an important concept in public life because it's closely related to truth. In the context of the pandemic, it may help us inquire more effectively, as well as evaluate what we hear and see. I shall be asking how the idea of objectivity comes to us, what it means, and what the implications are for the way I make judgments. I approach the theme with the transdisciplinary and critical mind of an artist. The word objectivity comes from the Latin ob, meaning from, and ject, meaning thrown. It literally means relating to something thrown from its context and placed before the eyes, as happens when you look at something under a microscope or through a lens. As such, it refers to a special way of seeing. To see objectively was at the centre of what it meant to be modern. In Europe, from the 16th century onwards, there was an attempt by scholars to find ways of seeing that was able to apprehend a thing in itself, its properties, qualities, and nature, rather than things as they present themselves to human consciousness. Figures such as Francis Bacon and René Descartes were all too aware that consciousness distorts reality. They thought of consciousness as a kind of filter. Through consciousness, reality becomes coloured by human will, interests, human desires, hopes, anxieties. So when we observe something in the world, we don't see a thing in itself at all. We see a thing altered by the act of looking. For the modern mind, the question was then, how do I get myself out of the picture? How can I get a thing? How can I see a thing in itself? Or to use the terminology we're investigating, how do I see objectively? The course of history since the 16th century has witnessed many different answers to this question. In their book Objectivity, Lorraine Gaston and Peter Gallison explore some of them through an investigation of practices such as botanical drawing, philosophical writing, and photography. For instance, they show how a new kind of drawing emerged that attempted to be scientific by removing the personality of the artist. You had to be true to nature. This one by Réaumur is done in 1734. It shows the head and proboscis of a bee. Notice, though, how the images have numbers on them, how it is flattened in ways that have nothing to do with reality, and how it's perfectly symmetrical. We're left wondering whether there was any such bee that looked like this, or whether the human idea of a bee was still at large in images of this kind. You could also try to be mechanical. The idea was to see like a machine. Photography as a way of recording the world developed out of this value. Here are images of a splash of milk by pioneering fluid mechanics engineer Arthur Worthington. Worthington produced these drawings around 1894, before he could make photographs of things that moved fast. He shone a bright light through a falling droplet and then tried to record on paper the after image left on the back of his eye, as happens when we look at a bright light and then look away from it. The machine, the argument went, does not idealize. It sees reality as it is, with all its blemishes and imperfections. It makes truth evident. The relevance of these images to this inquiry may not be so much in their successes as in what they reveal about the struggle to establish truth. On the one hand, they show just how difficult it is to achieve it, making us cautious about our own claims to see things as they really are. On the other, they give us something from which we can take strength, the fact that our difficulties are shared, that our efforts to deal with them sit within a whole community of practice, and that there is a lot more interesting work to be done. A third idea is that if you saw yourself as a political commentator or as a social scientist, you could try to develop a more scientific self. This would involve thinking rationally and finding ways of eliminating prejudice, bias, superstition. The philosopher Immanuel Kant argued in 1790 that we need to try to enlarge our thought by seeing things not from our own point of view, but from a universal standpoint. He writes, "However small may be the area or the degree to which a man's natural gifts reach, yet it indicates a man of enlarged thought, that if he disregards the subjective, private conditions of his own judgment, by which so many others are confined, and reflects upon it from a universal standpoint, which he can only determine by placing himself at the standpoint of others." Kant's idea of objectivity was a U-turn on previous understandings, because he did away with sensation as a foundation for knowledge. For example, things you see or things you think you see. An objective experience had to do with what could be universally known. It was arrived at from what a wide public could recognize as true, what they could verify through logic and reason. Kant presumed his public to be male and called them the sensus communis, a phrase from which we get the contemporary English common sense. In this way, he thought, prejudice, private beliefs, desires, fantasies, and so on would be eradicated. A good citizen would suppress his subjectivity. Kant's idea of objectivity is still very much at large. Coupled with existing ideas of evidence and witnessing, rationality and public debate, these things form the basis of knowledge across the sciences, political sciences, and economics. The World Health Organization, a transnational body that aspires to advance public health from outside the interests of any nation state or private corporation, is a direct offspring of such an understanding of objectivity. But these ideas of objectivity are under attack from both the left and the right. I'll deal first with the right. The threat to public confidence in government brought by coronavirus has led to accusations by the US President Trump that the WHO, that's the World Health Organization, is China-centered. It suppressed the truth about the virus till it was too late because China persuaded it to do so. Also on the right, conspiracy theories have told us that the virus doesn't exist in the first place, but is an attempt to rein in personal freedom. The critique of objectivity from the left has been more sustained and systematic. Post-colonial thinkers in particular, positioned as they are from outside dominant Anglo-European values and American values, have done much within the last 70 years, questioning whether there could ever really be a universal worldview. Specifically in relation to coronavirus, commentators have revealed just how much prejudice exists and how it is built into the very fabric of our society. So much so that in Europe and the US, black and minority ethnic people are more vulnerable to the virus than white people. There is also the suspicion that the attempt to see universally is an attempt to encourage people to see the world in a way that suits the dominant regime. To do so, people would have to step outside their culture, their gender, their personal experiences. How naive that must be, but also how dull. For sure, reason is important, but we're humans, not machines, and our faith in reason needs to be tempered by other values, such as individual narratives and voices of individual people who have experienced something firsthand if we are to resist oppression. Let's hear then personal stories from people who have first-hand experience of a situation, and let's train our judgment to interpret them. Thank you for listening.